Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 2 about constitutional history, and it's Lesson 11 concerning checks and balances. In this lesson, you'll learn what checks and balances are. You'll learn about congressional checks and about executive checks. Now, the context for this lesson is that the founders, the people who wrote the Constitution of the United States of America, built into that document multiple structural limitations on the powers of the national government. They did this because they were afraid of creating a government that would become too powerful and oppress the people. So while they knew that they needed to give it a certain amount of power to take care of things that had been troublesome under the Articles of Confederation, they knew that they wanted to, in some way, restrain its power. And in the previous lesson, we talked about some of those restraints, such as regular elections, federalism, and separation of powers. Now we'll talk about an additional one of these auxiliary precautions, as we call it in the previous lesson. And that is an idea that builds on the notion of separation of powers that we previously discussed. So under separation of powers, you divide up the functions of a government. And by dividing up the functions, separating them out, you hopefully make it too difficult to get enough power concentrated in one place to then just arbitrarily oppress the people. But you can go even a step further beyond merely separating the powers and begin to, as it talked about in this quote from James Madison, use ambition to counteract ambition, as it says down there in that bottom line. And you would do this by giving those who run the departments both the means and the motives to resist encroachments of each other. Now, what that basically means is that once you've divided up the power of these branches of government, the people who serve in those places are probably going to be ambitious people who like power. That's why they go into government. And they're going to have a natural tendency to want to extend their power, to grow it, and encroach on the power of others. And so Madison said a way to prevent that is by allowing each of these branches to have the means to push back against each other, to stop each other from going beyond the boundaries that the people had set in the Constitution. And so that concept is called checks and balances. So, as you can see on this diagram, we have the three branches of government. But rather than being entirely separated, they're now actually overlapping just a little bit. And it's in that overlap that then they can check and balance each other. The easiest, biggest example to understand that people have most commonly heard of, is how the executive branch overlaps with the legislative branch just slightly. In other words, participates a little bit in the process of legislation and uses that little bit of overlapping power to stop the legislative branch potentially from overstepping its boundaries. And that little bit of overlap is what we call the veto power, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. But that's an example of how these branches of government overlap a little bit. So the executive is involved a little bit in the judicial and the legislative. The judicial is involved a little bit in the executive and the legislative. And the legislative is involved a little bit in the executive and the judicial. So none of them can exercise their power entirely on their own. And the other branches have a way to stop them from doing things that they don't like. So now let's look at specific examples of congressional checks. In other words, ways that the Congress, the legislative branch, can use its power to try to check the powers of the other branches. One of those is that under our United States Constitution, the Congress controls the budget. In other words, they decide where the money is going to be spent. So if some president, for example, decided to send our troops off to engage in a war somewhere in the world, and the Congress didn't like that the president was trying to fight a war there, an easy way for the Congress to stop the president from doing that thing would be to cut off his money, cut off his budget. And so in this way, the Congress can try to control another branch from behaving in a way that's not just inappropriate, but even more ideally, goes beyond the assigned powers that that branch was given under the Constitution. They're abusing their power. Congress can step in and try to stop them by simply taking away their money. The second way that Congress can try to control the other branches is through a process called impeachment and trial. An impeachment is an accusation towards some other person in government, such as a Supreme Court justice or the President of the United States. An accusation toward them that they've done something bad enough they should be kicked out of office. It's actually the House of Representatives that impeaches people, in other words, accuses them of having done something bad enough that they should be removed from their job. Then a trial is held, a trial by the United States Senate, acting basically as a jury of 100, decides whether to actually kick that person out of office or not. This is a way that the Congress, the legislative branch, can try to stop other members of the government from abusing their power by simply kicking them out of office. A third check that Congress has on the other branches is a concept called advice and consent. Now, I say this is a power of Congress. It's actually a power lodged in one house of Congress, the Senate. But for right now, you don't need to worry about that. Just realize that Congress is assigned by the Constitution the power to give advice to the president when he's trying to either appoint someone to some job in government, such as a justice on the Supreme Court, or give him advice when he's negotiating a treaty with some other country. And then after having given advice to him about these sorts of things, the Senate has to actually consent before the president can do them. So before he can appoint someone to the United States Supreme Court, the United States Senate has to vote and agree. Before he can enter into a treaty with another country, the Senate has to vote and agree. Well, this is a way for the Congress, through the Senate, to directly stop the president from doing something they don't like. And a fourth way that Congress can check the branches, the power of another branch of government, is that they are signed in the Constitution to create inferior courts. In other words, courts below the Supreme Court. While the Supreme Court of the United States is created by the United States Constitution, all the other courts in our national court system are created by Congress, which means theoretically, if Congress knows that these courts were abusing their power, because Congress created them, Congress could get rid of them and start all over with a brand new set of courts. So that's sort of the ultimate way of stopping someone from abusing their power. You simply eliminate them. All right, so that's how Congress can potentially check the other branches of government. Now let's examine how the executive, or in other words, the president, can check the other branches of government. And I'm going to explain 3 ways that the president can do that. The first is one that I already mentioned in this lesson, and that is that when Congress passes a law that the president doesn't like, particularly if he thinks it's unconstitutional, it's an abuse of power or something like that, he can veto it, which means he rejects it and will not allow it to become a law. And that's a power assigned to him by the Constitution. The second executive check on the power of the other branches is the pardon power. This is where the president can release people from prison who've been convicted of breaking a national law. Now, this is a check on the other branches, because if someone's in prison for having broken a national law, they were placed there by the judicial system. And they were placed there by the judicial system because they violated a law passed by the legislative branch. So, in essence, both the legislative branch and the judicial branch are saying that that person should be in prison. But the president can step in and say, no, they shouldn't be, and let them go. And presidents all exercise this power to some extent. Some have pardoned very few people. Some have pardoned a lot of people. But it's a way for them to not just provide individual relief for somebody who may have technically committed a crime and gone to prison for it, but they're actually an upstanding citizen that should be free, and so the president steps in their unique situation and lets them go. It's also a way for the president to blanketly undermine the actions of the other branches that he considers to be inappropriate and wrong. The third way that a president can check and control another branch is through calling special sessions of Congress. Now, Congress meets at certain times and then takes vacations. What this power allows the president to do is to make them come back to meet as a Congress when they're supposed to be on vacation. Now, he ideally should be doing this when he thinks there's some pressing problem that they should be dealing with that they otherwise wouldn't. But it can be used as a way to prevent abuses of power by the Congress. The president can simply threaten that he's going to call them back for a special session if they don't do something responsible that he wants them to do. And because they love their vacations, they may well give in to his demands and change their mind about what they were doing. So that does it for the material in this lesson. Let's review what we learned. First of all, what are checks and balances? Are they separation of powers? Are they budget priorities? Are they deficits and debts? Or are they overlapping powers? Checks and balances are overlapping powers. They are areas where the judiciary has a little bit of control of the legislative process, or the legislature has a little bit of control of the executive carrying out his jobs, or the executive has a little bit of power over the legislature making laws. They overlap a little bit, and it allows them to control each other a little bit and hopefully stop each other from doing bad things. Which is a congressional check on the other branches? Is it budget control, or pardon, or veto, or constitutional review? For Congress, it's controlling the budget, deciding where the money is. The other powers listed here are held by other branches. And our last question with this lesson is, which of the following is an executive check on the other branches? Is it creating inferior courts? Is it impeachment? Is it the veto? Or is it advice and consent? Well, the other powers listed here belong to other branches. The one that belongs to the executive branch, or in other words, the president, is the veto power. And that does it for this lesson. Next lesson will be from Unit 2. It'll be Lesson 12, and it'll be about judicial review.